Right, before we start, settle in somewhere comfortable. There is no need to follow any of this closely, and honestly I would rather you didn't. This is one of those slow ones, the kind where you can drift off halfway through and not miss a single thing, because there is no big reveal waiting at the end and nothing here is building towards anything in particular. It is just me, talking quietly about a lake, for a good long while. And it is a strange thing, when you stop and think about it, that this lake exists at all. Most lakes are simply there. They settled into their hollow long before anyone turned up to name them, and they will sit there long after we have all gone. This one is different. This one is here because well over 100 years ago a group of men looked at a river running through a set of limestone canyons in the middle of Texas and decided the river was the wrong shape. So they built a wall across it. The water backed up behind the wall and that became the lake, which means somewhere in a filing cabinet this lake effectively has a birthday. You don't get that with most lakes, and I find it quietly funny. The lake is called Medina Lake, and it sits out in the Texas Hill Country, a bit northwest of San Antonio. Right now it is having a rough time of it. The water is very low, lower than most of the people who live around it have ever seen, and they have seen it low before. There are headlines about it, the sort with sharp little numbers in them designed to make you sit up straight, and we will get to those numbers eventually, calmly, with no drama attached to them. But that is not really why I wanted to talk about it tonight. I wanted to talk about it because it has a genuinely lovely, slightly daft, occasionally rather sad story behind it, and almost nobody knows any of it. The man who built it, the little towns that grew up along its edge, the way the whole thing quietly feeds water to millions of people through a trick of the rock underneath that nobody entirely planned. The folks living on its shore right now, watching their wells, hauling water in tanks, getting on with it the way people do. It is all in there, and it makes for a good long wander. So that is the plan. We are going to wander, around the lake, back through its history, down into the stone beneath it, and out to the kitchen taps of the people who depend on it. No particular hurry about any of it. If you are somehow still awake by the end, I will be mildly impressed, but I am genuinely not expecting it, and that is rather the point of the whole exercise. If you do enjoy this sort of thing, the slow stories about real places that nobody else bothers with, there is more of it on the channel, and a quiet subscribe helps me know to keep making them. That is the only time I will bring it up, I promise. Now, let me tell you where this lake actually is. The Texas Hill Country is one of those places that does not look like the Texas most people carry around in their heads. If your mental picture of Texas is flat and dusty and brown, with a horizon you could check with a spirit level, the Hill Country will throw you a bit. It rolls. It genuinely has hills, which is decent of it given the name. The land folds itself up into low limestone ridges wearing scrubby coats of trees, and down between the ridges run rivers that are clear and green and surprisingly cold, which feels a little unfair for a part of the world that gets as hot as this one does in summer. Medina Lake sits right in the thick of all that, draped across two counties, Bandera and Medina, just northwest of the city of San Antonio. On a map it has this lovely lazy crescent shape, curving its way west to east, about 18 miles long when it is full, 3 miles across at its widest part, with something like 110 miles of shoreline wrinkling in and out of all the little coves and inlets. That is when it is full, mind you. It is rarely full. We will come back to that because it turns out to be one of the more interesting things about this particular lake. The hills around it are made of limestone, the soft pale kind that water loves to eat its way into, and they are covered mostly in Asher juniper, which the locals call cedar even though it isn't really cedar, plus live oak and persimmon and black walnut, and here and there, if you are lucky, a madrone tree with that smooth red bark that looks almost polished. Down along the Medina River itself, where the water has run for far longer than the lake has existed, you get bald cypress. Big old ones, with their knees poking up out of the wet ground, the sort of tree that makes a place feel older than it is. And the water, when there is water, is that same hill country green. Not murky, not blue exactly, but a sort of soft jade that comes from all the dissolved limestone. On a still morning it goes flat as a sheet of glass, and the cypress and the cedar lean over and look at themselves in it, and the whole thing is, I will be honest, properly gorgeous. It is the kind of view that makes city people from San Antonio drive out at the weekend just to sit and look at it. Now Texas has flashier lakes than this one. It has the big famous ones with the marinas and the lakeside mansions and the speedboats stacked 3 deep on a Saturday. Medina was never quite that. It has always been a bit quieter, a bit more out of the way, a lake people retire to rather than show off at, and I rather like it for that. It has the feel of a place that is getting on with its own business, and is not especially fussed whether you have heard of it, which, until recently, most people hadn't. But a lake like this does not just appear out of the ground, all crescent-shaped and photogenic, waiting for the weekend traffic. Somebody had to dream it up first, and the somebody who dreamed it up has, I think, one of the strangest stories you will find attached to any reservoir anywhere. So let me introduce him. The first person to look at this stretch of the Medina River and see a lake that wasn't there yet was a man named Henry Castro, and he was doing it all the way back in the 1840s. Castro was a colonizer, in the old sense of the word, one of those people who brought settlers over from Europe to start towns on the Texas frontier, and he had a good eye for land. He looked at the deep canyons the Medina River had carved and thought, if you could just hold back the floodwater that comes tearing through here every so often, you could use it to irrigate all those dry farms further south. It was a genuinely clever idea. It was also an idea about 50 years too early. Castro had the vision but not the money, nor the engineering, nor really the moment, and so the thought just sat there, unbothered, for half a century. Which I find quite relatable, honestly. Most of my best ideas also just sit there unbothered for decades. It got picked back up around 1894 by a San Antonio engineer called Alex Walton, who got excited about the same possibility, damming the Medina's floodwaters, and talked it over with a couple of other engineers. And again, the wall they kept running into was money. Nobody could raise the funds. Building a dam is enormously expensive, and back then there was no government agency you could go to with a nice slideshow. You had to find rich people willing to gamble on it. The rich people finally turned up around 1910, in the form of an engineer named Dr. Fred Stark Pearson. Now Pearson was a proper character of the age, the sort they really do not make anymore. He was an internationally known engineer who had built power projects all over North and South America, and crucially he had the ear of investors, particularly British investors with deep pockets. He looked at the Medina scheme, decided it could work, and persuaded a group of British financiers to put up the money. And with that, after 70 years of the idea just floating about, the thing finally got built. And good grief, did they build it fast. The pace was frankly a bit mad. They had something like 1,500 men working around the clock, in shifts day and night, mixing concrete. The numbers are the kind that stop you for a second. Roughly 292,000 cubic yards of concrete went into the main dam. The finished wall stood about 164 feet high. When it was done, in November of 1912, it was the largest dam in the entire state of Texas, and the fourth largest in the whole of the United States. And they did this in 1912. No real heavy machinery as we would understand it. Mostly men, mules, hand tools, and an absolutely relentless schedule. They were in such a hurry, partly because they expected big floods to come along in 1913 and fill the thing up, and they wanted to be ready to catch the water. They even ran a railway line out to the dam site to haul materials, 14 miles of fresh track laid through the hills just to keep the concrete coming. There is something about that level of confidence I find genuinely charming. These men were absolutely certain the rain would come and the lake would fill and the whole valley below would bloom into green farmland. They bet everything on it. That confidence did not end up rewarded, not in the way they hoped, though that is a story for a little later. For now, I want to stay with Pearson, the man whose name and nerve made the whole thing real. Because his story takes a turn that, if you put it in a novel, an editor would tell you to tone it down for being too much. So here is what happened to Dr. Fred Stark Pearson. The dam went up in 1912, financed largely by his British investors, and then, in 1914, the First World War broke out, and that rather complicated everything, because suddenly the British money and the British attention were both being pulled towards more urgent matters than a reservoir in Texas. The financing got tangled. Pearson needed to go and sort it out in person, to find new capital and keep the project from falling apart at the money end. And so, in 1915, Pearson and his wife boarded a ship to sail across to England. The ship was the Lusitania. If you know your history, you can already feel where this is going, and I'm sorry for it, because it is one of those true details that lands with a soft thud. The Lusitania was torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland in May of 1915, and it went down with a terrible loss of life, and Pearson and his wife were both among the people who did not survive. The man who had spent his career building power stations and dams across 2 continents, the man who had finally turned Henri Castro's 70-year-old daydream into a 160-foot wall of concrete holding back a river, died at sea on his way to keep that very project afloat. I think about that sometimes, the strange shape of it. He never really got to see how his lake turned out over the long run. He got it built, and then the war took him before the story had properly started. The thing he made is still there, still doing its job over a century later, and he has been gone almost the whole time. There is a quiet kind of sadness in that, but also something rather grand. Most of us do not leave behind a lake. The project did carry on without him, as projects do. The irrigation network he had set in motion went on to bring a genuine wave of prosperity to the farmland below, which I will tell you about properly later, because it is its own neat little story. But the war had cut the cord to those original British backers, and the whole enterprise had to find its feet again with new owners and new money. The lake outlived the men who dreamed it, which is, I suppose, the usual arrangement between people and the big things they build. There are a few plaques on the dam now marking it as a historic landmark, recognising it as a feat of engineering and so on. Bronze plaques bolted to old concrete, the way these things always end up. And I doubt many of the people walking past them on a hot afternoon stop to read them, or know that the man behind the whole thing went down on the Lusitania. It is the sort of fact that just sits there, attached to the place, waiting for somebody curious enough to dig it up, which, well, here we are, anyway. Let me get back to that bet the builders made, the one where they were so sure the floods of 1913 would roll in and fill their brand new lake. Because the way that turned out tells you almost everything you need to know about the personality of this lake. And yes, I do think lakes have personalities, and this one's is a bit of a tease. So picture the scene. It is late 1912. The dam is finished. 1,500 exhausted men have just spent the better part of 2 years pouring concrete around the clock, fully expecting that the next big rains would come along and reward them with a great brimming reservoir. The valley is ready. The canals are being dug. Everyone is waiting for the water, and the rain did not come. Not for ages. After the dam was completed, it was something like 18 months before any significant rain fell. 18 months of staring at a very expensive, very empty concrete wall with a sad little trickle of river behind it. You can imagine the mood. All that confidence, all that hurry, all those mules and that fresh railway track, and the sky just refused to cooperate. The lake that was supposed to fill in a season took its sweet time, and it was not actually filled all the way to capacity for the first time until September of 1919, 7 years after they finished the dam. 7 years. And here is the thing, the detail I genuinely love about this place. That slow, reluctant, disappointing start was not a fluke. It turned out to be the lake's whole character. The Medina River watershed, the area of land that drains rain down into the lake, has simply never been able to supply the amount of water the designers imagined it would. Whether they overestimated how much rain would fall, or misjudged the size of the watershed, or some mixture of both, nobody is entirely sure. But the upshot is that this lake has spent its entire existence with wildly swinging water levels, up after a wet spell, right down again after a dry one, over and over, for more than 100 years. So when you read a headline today about Medina Lake being shockingly low, it is worth holding this in your mind. Low is not new for Medina. Low is practically its default setting. It has always been a moody up and down sort of lake, generous one decade and stingy the next. This is a body of water that disappointed the people who built it within its first 2 years of existence, and it has been keeping that tradition going ever since. I find that oddly comforting in a way. We tend to talk about a low lake as though something has gone terribly wrong, as though the lake has broken. But Medina has never really promised to behave. It is sitting on top of porous limestone in a part of the world prone to long droughts, fed by a river that has always run thinner than anyone hoped. Going down is just one of the 2 things it does. The other thing it does is come back up, which it has also done, many times, sometimes dramatically. That said, and I do not want to wave the current situation away because it is real and it matters to the people living there, this particular low stretch has gone on a long time and gone down very far, and we will get to exactly how far in due course. But the long view, the 100-year view, is that this lake has always lived by the rain in a way that more reliable reservoirs do not. It was born thirsty, and it has stayed thirsty its whole life. There is a lovely bit of trivia attached to all this, actually. A reverend named Cyril Matthew Quain wrote a whole book about the lake back in the 1960s, and he called it Ripples from Medina Lake, which is a gorgeous title for a book about a body of water that spends half its time not having enough ripples to go around. I have not read it, I will admit, but the title alone tells you people have been fond of this place, and writing about it, for a very long time. It has had its chroniclers. Not many lakes this size and this quiet get a whole book to themselves. Now, all these people fussing over the lake had to live somewhere, and the little settlements that grew up around it have some of the best names and oddest histories of anywhere in the hill country. So let me take you on a quick tour of the neighbours. Right at the south end, near the dam itself, there is a little place called Miko, and the name Miko is, I think, one of my favourite bits in this whole story, because it is not really a name at all. It is an acronym, MICO. It stands for the Medina Irrigation Company, the outfit that built the dam. They needed somewhere for the workers and the operation to be based. A little community sprang up at the dam site, and rather than think very hard about it, they just named the place after the company's initials. Miko. I love that. It is the civic planning equivalent of naming your dog Dog. And Miko could not even make its mind up about being called Miko. Its post office opened in 1911 under the name Miko. Then in 1916 it changed its name to Medina Lake. Then in 1923 it changed its mind again and went back to Miko. 3 names in 12 years, and 2 of them the same name. By the year 2000 the population was estimated at around 98 people, so we're talking about a properly tiny spot, a fishing resort really, a handful of houses and not much else. But it has been there, in one naming mood or another, since before the lake was full. Further round, up on the higher ground, you get Lake Hills, which is exactly what it sounds like. A community of lakeside cabins and homes spread over the hills above the water. Lake Hills is the closest thing the lake has to a proper town, the place with the lakefront cabins and the fishing and the easy weekend escape from the city. There was also, at one point, a settlement that went by the wonderfully literal name of Upper Medina Lake. The people who named things around here were clearly not paid by the syllable, and I respect that enormously. You always know exactly where you are, and then, a bit further out, you have Bandera, which is the seat of Bandera County, and Bandera has given itself the title of the cowboy capital of the world. Said so right there in the records. The Texas legislature even went along with it. Now Bandera is not big. It is rich in frontier spirit and dude ranches and that whole old cowboy character, but it is not rich in actual people. It is a small town with a very large hat, if you take my meaning. But it is the kind of place that holds a rodeo and means it, and it gives the whole Medina Lake area this flavour of genuine, slightly weathered Old West, rather than the theme park version. So that is the neighbourhood, a fishing hamlet named after a company's initials, a scatter of cabins on the hills, a ghost of a place called Upper Medina Lake, and a self-declared cowboy capital down the road. These are not boom towns. Nobody got rich here. These are quiet places where people came to retire by the water, or to fish, or to escape San Antonio for a couple of days, and where, frankly, the falling lake level has become a much bigger part of daily life than anybody who moved here for the peace and quiet ever signed up for. Because here is the thing that ties all these little places together, and it is the thing the headlines are really about. The lake is not just a nice view for these communities. It is wrapped up in their water in ways that are not at all obvious until you understand what is going on underneath. But before we go underground, I want to tell you what this lake was actually built to do. Because it was never built for the cabins or the fishing or the lovely green views. It had a job. A proper, serious, agricultural job. And it has been doing that job, more or less, for over a century. Here is a thing that surprises people. Medina Lake was never built for fun. Not for the boating, not for the swimming, not for the bloke in the lawn chair with a fishing rod and a cold drink. All of that came later, as a sort of happy accident. The lake was built to water farms. It is at heart an irrigation reservoir. The entire point of holding back the Medina River was to capture that water and then deliver it, in a controlled way, down to the dry farmland below the hills, in the flatter country to the south around towns like Castroville, Lacoste, Natalia, and Devine. And the way they chose to deliver it is the part I find genuinely beautiful, in an engineering sort of way. They built canals, an extensive system of them, branching out across tens of thousands of acres of farmland, something like 33,000 acres of irrigated fields fed by water that started its journey up in the lake. And the clever bit, The bit that makes me a little giddy, if I am honest, is that the whole system was designed to run on gravity alone. No pumps, none. The lake sits up in the hills, the farmland sits lower down below the limestone escarpment, and so all you have to do is open the right gates and let the water find its own way downhill through the canals, obeying nothing more complicated than the natural pull of the earth. Water goes down. That is the entire technology. They just arranged the landscape so that down was where the crops were. When it was first built, this was the biggest irrigation project west of the Mississippi River. Think about that for a second. The biggest in that whole enormous half of the country. Out here, in the quiet hill country, fed by a moody river that could barely fill its own lake. For a while, this was about as advanced as anyone got with water and stone and a good understanding of which way is down. And it worked. The farmland below genuinely flourished. The irrigation network turned dry, marginal ground into productive fields, and brought a real wave of prosperity to that part of the country, exactly as Henry Castro had imagined back in the 1840s, when he first squinted at those canyons. It took 70 years and a doomed engineer and a small army of labourers, but the old daydream did eventually come true. The farms got their water. The body that manages all this today goes by a real mouthful of a name, the Bexar Medina Atascosa Water Control and Improvement District No. 1, which everyone sensibly just shortens to BMA. They are the ones who hold the rights to the water in the lake and who decide, through the gates and the canals, how much of it goes downstream to the farmers and when. They are, in a sense, the lake's management. And as you might imagine, when a lake is this low, the question of how that water gets handled becomes a rather tense one, with farmers who need irrigation on one side and lakeside residents who want to keep some water in the lake on the other. That is a genuine, long-running disagreement, and I will give it its own moment later, fairly, because there are decent people on both sides of it. But for now, I just want you to sit with the basic shape of the thing. This pretty lake that people retire to is, underneath the postcard, a giant gravity-powered watering can for the farms below. That is its day job. That is what it is for. The cabins and the fishing rods are the hobby it picked up on the side, and there is a smaller, quieter piece of the machinery that almost nobody ever mentions, sitting just downstream of the main dam, doing its own modest job. About 4 miles below the big famous Medina Dam, there is a second dam, a much smaller one, and it forms a much smaller lake called Diversion Lake, and almost nobody ever talks about it, which is precisely why I want to. The idea behind it is rather neat and very practical. When you release water from the main lake, it comes down the river, and you need somewhere to collect it again before sending it off into the canal system that feeds the farms. So rather than running the canals all the way up to the main dam, which would have meant digging an extra 4 miles of expensive canal, they just built a little dam downstream to catch the released water in a small pool. From that pool, the diversion pool, the water gets sent off into the canals. It saved them 4 miles of digging. It is a tidy bit of problem solving, the kind that does not get plaques and does not get books written about it, but quietly makes the whole system work. Diversion Lake is small, only a few hundred acres, nothing like the sprawling crescent of the main lake. It is a working pool, really, a sort of staging area for water on its way to the fields. But I have a soft spot for it, because it is so completely unglamorous and so completely useful. The main dam gets all the attention, the historic landmark status, the engineering awards, the tourists. The diversion dam just sits there 4 miles down the road, doing the boring essential job of catching the water and pointing it in the right direction, and has done for over a century without complaint. And there is one quiet detail about both of these lakes that is easy to walk straight past. Both of these lakes, the big main one and the little diversion one, were built sitting partly on top of a particular kind of rock, limestone. Specifically the Edwards limestone, which is a famously leaky, holy, cavey sort of stone. And that single geological fact, the fact that they built these lakes on rock that does not hold water terribly well, turns out to be one of the most important things about the entire Medina system. It was, depending on how you look at it, either a flaw or a feature, and the honest answer is that it became both. Because the water that seeps out through the bottom of these lakes does not just vanish into nowhere. It goes somewhere very specific, and what it does when it gets there quietly supports the water supply of an awful lot of people who have probably never heard of Medina Lake and never will. So let me take you underground for a bit. Mind your head. So, the lakes sit on Edwards limestone and Edwards limestone leaks. Water from the bottom of Medina Lake and Diversion Lake seeps down through cracks and holes in that rock and trickles away out of the lakes. On the face of it, that sounds like a problem. You build a reservoir to hold water and the ground underneath it keeps stealing your water. For a place that already struggles to fill, you would think a leaky bottom would be the last thing you want. But here is the lovely twist. That leaking water is not lost at all. It drains straight down into the Edwards Aquifer, which is one of the most important sources of groundwater in the entire state of Texas, the great underground reservoir that supplies drinking water to San Antonio and a huge stretch of the surrounding region. And it turns out that Medina Lake and its little diversion pool, by leaking the way they do, are not just contributing a bit to that aquifer, they are between them the single largest recharge source feeding the Edwards Aquifer. The biggest. The leak is the point. I want to make sure that lands properly because the first time I understood it, I had to sit back a moment. This lake that disappointed its builders, that never holds the water people want it to hold, that loses huge amounts down through the porous rock beneath it, is losing that water into the ground in a way that quietly tops up the drinking supply for millions of people. The thing that looks like the lake's biggest failure, its inability to keep hold of its own water, is actually one of its most valuable functions. It is a sieve that happens to be plumbed directly into one of the most important aquifers in America. The folks at the United States Geological Survey have been studying this for decades because it matters enormously to the people downstream who rely on that aquifer, and they have done careful water budget analyses going back to the 1950s and running right up to a fresh study published in 2025. The basic finding in the older work was that on average something on the order of a few thousand acre-feet of water per month seeps out of the Medina system and down into the aquifer. An acre-foot, by the way, is the amount of water it takes to cover 1 acre of land to a depth of 1 foot, which is a wonderfully old-fashioned and very American way of measuring water, and it adds up to a great deal of water indeed. A few thousand of them a month, sliding quietly out of a leaky lake and into the rock, recharging a supply that whole cities lean on. And here is the slightly melancholy knock-on effect of all that, the bit that connects the leak back to the current low water. When the lake is low, there is less water sitting on top of that leaky rock, and so there is less of it seeping down to recharge the aquifer. A low Medina Lake is not just a problem for the cabins and the fishermen and the farmers downstream. It is a quiet reduction in one of the biggest natural top-ups the regional groundwater gets. The lake going down means the rock underneath gets a smaller drink than usual. Everything here is connected to everything else, and most of the connections run underground where you cannot see them. Which brings us finally to the bit the headlines are really shouting about. The town above the lake, and the wells, and the people watching their taps. Because the same porous rock that makes this lake such a good aquifer recharge also ties the lake's level directly to the water under everyone's feet. And when the lake drops, the ground gets thirsty too. Right, so here is the puzzle that confuses a lot of people when they first hear about it, and it confused me too. The town up around the lake, the lakeside homes in Lake Hills and Miko and so on, those houses do not get their water from the lake. Not directly. Most of them are on private wells drilled down into the ground, pulling up groundwater, so your first instinct is to think, well, if the houses run on wells, and the wells run on groundwater, then who cares how low the lake gets? The lake and the wells are two separate things, right? Except they are not separate at all. And the reason they are not separate is, once again, that porous limestone. The way the man who manages the local groundwater district explains it is lovely and clear, so I will borrow his framing. When the lake is full, all the water sitting up there acts like a kind of stopper. It holds the water table up in the surrounding ground, sort of presses against it, keeps the groundwater from draining away out of the area. A full lake is like a thumb held over the end of a hose. As long as the lake is high, the ground around it stays nicely saturated, and the wells drilled into that ground have plenty to draw from. But when the lake drops, that stopper comes out. With less water in the lake to press back against it, the groundwater starts to flow out and away, draining down and off, and the water table in the surrounding ground falls right along with the lake. So the wells that used to reach comfortably down into wet ground suddenly find themselves reaching down into ground that has gone dry. The lake does not feed the wells directly, but it holds the whole local water table in place, and when it lets go, the wells go with it. So the headline about the town above the lake being on the edge of running dry is not really about a pipe from the lake to the houses being switched off. It is subtler and, in a way, sadder than that. It is about an entire neighbourhood of private wells slowly losing their water because the great body of water that used to hold the ground up has shrunk back too far to do the job. The lake and the wells were always one connected system. People just could not see the connection because the important half of it was underground, where the water moves through the rock in ways nobody can watch. And this is not unique to Medina, by the way, though it is especially pronounced here because of all that leaky Edwards limestone. It is a thing that happens around a lot of reservoirs sitting on the right kind of rock. When the surface water drops, the wells nearby tend to follow. There are other Texas communities that have learned this the hard way, and I will mention a couple of them later because there is some comfort, oddly, in knowing this has happened before and people have got through it. But knowing the mechanism, the physics of it, the thumb over the hose business, does not actually get you a glass of water when your tap runs dry. For the people living it, this is not a tidy diagram about water tables. It is a very practical, very expensive, very daily problem. So let me introduce you to one of them, because the story of this lake is, in the end, a story about the people who live beside it, and there is one fellow whose situation has stuck with me. There is a man named John Minturn who has lived on Medina Lake for more than 35 years. Picture that for a moment. 35 years in one spot by the water, watching the lake go up and down through all its moods, season after season, the way you would watch a neighbour grow old. He has seen this lake do a lot of things over 3.5 decades. The well on his property was drilled long before he ever got there. More than 70 years ago, the original owners put it down, and for 7 decades that well just worked. Never gave a moment's trouble. You turn the tap, the water comes, you do not think about it. Which is rather the whole point of a well. The best thing a well can be is boring. For 70 years, Minturn's well was reliably, beautifully boring. And then the lake dropped far enough for long enough that the ground around his place dried out beneath it and the well collapsed. Just gave up. After 70 years of faithful service, the water table sank away from underneath it, and the thing failed. And when he looked into getting it sorted, he was told it would cost something north of $12,000 just to clean the well out, and that they could not even say for certain when they would be able to get round to it because they were so swamped with other people in exactly the same boat. That is the detail that really gets me. He is not alone. There is a backlog. A whole queue of people up around that lake waiting for someone to come and rescue their wells. All at once, all for the same reason. So in the meantime, the man does what people in these situations end up doing. He pays to have water hauled in. Trucks bring it out to him, and it goes into storage tanks on his property. And that is how a household that sat comfortably on a 70-year-old well for decades now keeps the taps running. Water by the truckload into tanks in the yard in a part of Texas that is supposed to have a lake right there. It is the kind of thing that would have seemed absurd to suggest to him a few years ago. And I want to be careful how I tell this, because it is easy to make it sound like a tragedy, and the people living it would, I suspect, find that a bit much. From what I can gather, folks like Minturn are not sitting around wringing their hands. They are adapting. They are figuring out the storage tanks and the hauling schedules and the cost of it, grumbling about it, no doubt, the way you would, but getting on with it. There is a toughness to people who choose to live somewhere quiet and a bit remote, by a lake that has always been unpredictable. They knew, on some level, that they were signing up for a place with a temper. They probably did not expect it to get quite this bad, but they are coping. Still, $12,000 to fix a well that worked fine for 70 years. Water hauled in by truck and poured into tanks. A long backlog of neighbours all in the same situation. That is what the abstract numbers about lake levels actually look like once they reach somebody's kitchen. It is not dramatic exactly. It is just a steady, grinding, expensive inconvenience that has rearranged the daily life of a whole shoreline of people. And underneath it, always, is the lake, sitting lower than they have ever seen it, holding its water back from the ground the way it has on and off for 100 years, only this time for longer than usual, speaking of which. I have been dancing around the actual numbers this whole time, promising we would get to them calmly, so let me finally tell you plainly, and without any of the breathless headline energy, exactly how low this lake has got. All right, the numbers, I will lay them out gently, and then we will move on because a lake is more than a percentage, and I have no interest in standing here reciting statistics at you while you're trying to fall asleep. In April of 2025, Medina Lake dropped to what they call dead pool. That is the term for it. Dead pool. which sounds more dramatic than it is, but it does mean something specific and serious. It means the water got so low that it stopped flowing out downstream altogether. The level was sitting at around 2.5% of the lake's capacity. For a reservoir that, when full, stretches 18 miles and holds a couple of 100,000 acre-feet of water, that is barely a puddle by comparison. The crescent had shrunk back to almost nothing, just a thin remnant of water clinging to the deepest channel where the old river used to run. Now, the lake did get a brief reprieve later that year. Over the summer of 2025, heavy rains came through the hill country, and the lake rose a little, up to something in the region of 6%. I should say, gently, that those summer rains came in the form of severe and deadly flooding across parts of the region, which was a genuine tragedy for the communities caught in it, and I do not want to skate past that or dress it up as good news. The same water that lifted the lake a few feet caused real heartbreak elsewhere. Nature does not parcel these things out fairly, but in terms of the lake itself, the level ticked up briefly, and then, as the dry conditions settled back in, it began sliding down again. By early 2026, the lake was back down to around 4% of capacity. To put that in something you can picture, the surface of the water was sitting roughly 86 feet below where it would be if the lake were full. 86 feet. That is a wall of missing water taller than most buildings you will ever walk into. If the lake were full and you were standing on the current shoreline, you would be looking up at where the water used to reach, far over your head, up the slope of the exposed banks. That is the gap we are talking about. The official drought classification for the area has been sitting at the most severe category they have, the one they call exceptional, which is the top of the scale, the worst it gets on the chart. And the local authorities have brought in water restrictions to match, limiting how people can use water, tightening things up the way you do when the supply gets genuinely scarce. The folks who manage the lake's water have been operating under their strictest stage of restrictions. Everyone in the system, the farmers, the residents, the managers, has been pulling their belt in, and the man who runs the local river authority put it about as plainly as you can. He said, and I am paraphrasing only slightly, that it has just been so dry for so long. That is really the whole of it. Not one dramatic event, not a single catastrophe, just a long, grinding, stubborn, dry spell that would not let up, sitting on top of a lake that was already prone to going low at the best of times. Dry for so long. There is a weariness in that phrase that tells you more than any percentage does. So those are the numbers, and I am going to set them down now, and not pick them back up, because honestly, the more interesting thing about a lake this low is not how low it is what it shows you. Because when a lake pulls back this far, it uncovers things, decades of things, and wandering across an exposed lake bed, looking at what the water has been hiding, is one of the strangest and most quietly fascinating things you can do. So let us go for a walk on the bottom of the lake. There is something genuinely eerie, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, about walking out onto ground that is supposed to be underwater. A drained lake bed is one of the few places on Earth where you get to stand somewhere that is normally hidden, somewhere that has been quietly accumulating secrets for 100 years with nobody able to see. And when Medina pulls back like this, it gives a lot of those secrets up. The first thing that reappears is the lake's own past. The original Medina River, the actual river that ran through these canyons long before anyone built a wall across it, comes back into view. The lake was always sitting on top of that old riverbed, and when the water drops far enough, the river re-emerges, threading its way along the bottom of the basin, following the exact same course it followed for thousands of years before the dam. It is, in a way, the lake briefly turning back into the river it used to be. I find that rather moving. Strip away the reservoir and the older, truer shape of the place is still there underneath, patient, waiting. And along that re-exposed ground you get the stumps and skeletons of old cypress trees, the ones that grew along the river before the valley was flooded and then drowned when the lake filled. Bone grey now, worn smooth, poking up out of the cracked clay. And the cracked clay itself is a whole texture of its own, dried into those tile-like plates that curl up at the edges, the classic look of a lake bed that has not seen water in a long while. People who have walked it describe finding fish bones scattered across it like odd confetti, skulls and spines lying where shallow pools dried up, and the fish had nowhere left to go. It sounds grim written down, but in person, I gather it's more melancholy than gruesome, just the quiet evidence of a lake doing what this lake does. Then there is the human stuff, which is where it gets properly interesting. because a lake that has been a recreation spot for 100 years has had a lot of things dropped, sunk, abandoned, and forgotten in it. During an earlier deep low, back during the big drought of around 2010 to 2013, the receding water uncovered all sorts. Old oil drums, cracks and structures in the lake bed nobody had seen in years. And my absolute favourite detail in this entire story, a jeep. An actual jeep sitting out there on the bottom of the lake, having presumably been down there for who knows how long, just waiting for the water to drop far enough to reveal it. I have so many questions about that jeep, and I will never get answers to any of them, and I have made my peace with that. There is also genuine history down there, older than the lake. Out near the dam is a spot known as Mormon's Bluff, which was the site of one of the very first Mormon colonies in Texas, way back before the reservoir existed. There is a plaque on the dam recognizing it, sitting alongside the plaques for the engineering and the historic landmark status. So you have got this layering of stories all in one place, a frontier Mormon settlement, a doomed engineer, a record-breaking dam, and a jeep, all stacked up around the same patch of Texas limestone. And then there are the cattle. This is the image that, for me, sums up just how thoroughly a low lake transforms a place. When the water pulls back far enough, ranchers have simply let their cattle wander out and graze on the exposed lake bed, because grass and weeds grow up on all that newly uncovered ground. So you get cows standing around chewing, in the middle of what is supposed to be a lake, cattle grazing on the bottom of a reservoir. If you had shown that photograph to the men building the dam in 1912, the men so certain the floods would come, I think it might have broken their hearts a little. Or they would have laughed. Possibly both. It is a strange, still, slightly haunted landscape, a drained lake bed. Not frightening, just deeply odd, full of things that are not meant to be seen. And it raises a question that the people around the lake have been arguing about, with real feeling, for years now. Whose fault is all this? Is it just the drought, the dry for so long of it, or is somebody managing this lake badly? And that argument is worth understanding, because there is something to be said on both sides. Now I want to handle this next bit carefully and fairly, because it involves people who are genuinely upset, and money, and 100 years of accumulated grievance, and it would be easy to pick a side and make a villain. I am not going to do that, partly because I do not think there is a clean villain here, and partly because picking fights is not really what we're doing at 1 a.m. Here is the shape of the disagreement. On one side you have a group of lakeside residents and business owners, organised under the rather hopeful banner of Save Medina Lake. They have been at this for years, more than a decade by some accounts, and their basic position is that the lake's terrible lows are not purely an act of God. They argue that the way the water is managed, the way it gets released downstream through that big canal system to the farmers, makes the lows worse than they need to be. In their view, better management of the outflow could keep more water in the lake, and the people in charge are not doing enough of that. They have been pushing for years for changes, even trying to get the state to step in and force different practices. On the other side you have the water district, the BMA, the folks with the legal rights to that water, and the responsibility for delivering it to the farms it was always meant to serve. And their position, broadly, is that the lake is low because it has barely rained for years, because the sun evaporates an enormous amount of water off the surface in the Texas heat, and because, as we talked about earlier, a good chunk of it is constantly seeping down into the aquifer through that porous rock. In other words, the lake is low for natural reasons that no amount of clever gate management can fix. You cannot manage your way out of a drought. The water that is not falling from the sky is simply not there to keep in the lake. And the honest, slightly unsatisfying truth is that both of these things can be true at once. It is entirely possible that the drought is the overwhelming cause of the low water, and also possible that management choices make some difference at the margins. Water disputes are almost never clean because water is shared, and the moment a resource is shared between farmers who need to irrigate their crops and residents who want to keep their lake full and an aquifer quietly drinking from the bottom, you have a genuine conflict of interests with no perfect answer. Everybody in that argument has a reasonable point. They just have different reasonable points that cannot all be satisfied at the same time, especially when there is not enough water to go around in the first place. What I find most human about the whole thing is the emotion underneath it. For the people who live on that lake, who retired there, who built their lives around that view and that water, Watching it shrink year after year is genuinely painful, and pain wants a cause. It is much harder to be angry at the weather than at a water board. The weather does not hold meetings you can show up to. The weather does not have a phone number. So some of that grief, understandably, gets pointed at the management, because the management is at least something you can argue with. I do not say that to dismiss their concerns, which may well have real merit. I say it because I think it is a very recognisable, very human response to feeling like the place you love is slipping away, and wanting someone, anyone, to be accountable for it. Anyway, the argument rumbles on, as these things do, with no tidy resolution, which is itself rather true to the nature of this lake. It has always resisted tidy resolutions. But here is something that might take a bit of the edge off, for anyone listening who finds the whole situation a touch bleak. This is not the first time, not for Medina and not for Texas. The state has been here before, more than once, and there is a strange kind of reassurance in the long view. So let me zoom out, away from this particular dry spell, and look at the bigger pattern. The thing about Texas and water is that it has always been a relationship full of drama. Feast and famine, flood and drought, with not much sensible middle ground. And Medina Lake, as we have already established, is an especially moody example even by Texas standards. So while the current low is severe and real and hard on the people living through it, it is worth remembering that the lake has gone down to alarming levels before and come back. During that drought I mentioned a moment ago, around 2010 to 2013, the lake fell below 5% of capacity. That is when the Jeep and the oil drums turned up. People at the time were genuinely worried it might never recover, that this was the end of Medina as a lake. And then the rains came, as they eventually do, and the level climbed back, and the boats went back out, and the worry faded into the background the way worries do once the immediate cause lets up. The lake had a near-death experience and then carried on. It has done that more than once across its century of existence. Born thirsty, remember. This is, in the long run, simply what it does. And if you pull the camera back even further, past Medina, to the whole of Texas, you land on the great benchmark that every Texan water expert measures everything against, which is the drought of the 1950s. The drought of record, they call it. It ran for the better part of a decade, roughly the first half of the 50s, and it was so severe and so prolonged that it fundamentally changed how Texas thinks about water. It is the reason so many of the state's reservoirs got built in the years afterwards. It is the yardstick. When people in Texas want to say a drought is truly serious, they compare it to the 50s, and most of the time the 50s still win. That drought drove tiny ranching towns to the very edge of running out of water entirely, decades before the current troubles, which tells you this is an old story in this part of the world. And it is not just the deep past. In more recent memory, there have been other Texas communities that watched their wells fail as a nearby lake dropped, in almost exactly the way the homes around Medina are experiencing now. There was a little place called Spicewood Beach, sitting on Lake Travis, that effectively ran dry when the lake fell, and the well that served it could no longer keep up, and they had to truck water in to keep the taps flowing. There was a community called Silver Creek Village, near Lake Buchanan, where residents watched their wells drop as the lake receded and worried, with good reason, about where their water would come from. Different lakes, different towns, the same fundamental story. Surface water falls, the wells fall with it, and people improvise their way through with hauled water and patience until the rain returns. I find a quiet comfort in all of this, and I hope you do too, lying there. Not a smug comfort, not a brushing aside of how hard the current situation is, but there is something steadying about knowing that this region has faced down dry spells before, repeatedly, going back as far as the records reach, and that the towns and the lakes and the stubborn people in them have so far always come out the other side. The dry stretches have arguably been leaning longer and meaner of late, and I would not want to pretend otherwise. But the pattern of the place is boom and bust, not bust and gone. Texas has always lived by the rain, gratefully when it comes and grimly when it does not, and it has kept on living. Underneath all of it, of course, older than the lake and older than the drought and older than the arguments, there is the river. The Medina River, which was here first and will be here last. And I want to spend a little while down by the river before we wrap up, because it is the gentlest part of this whole story, and a good place to let things wind down. Before we drift down to the river, I want to take you back to the dam itself for a minute. because we have talked a lot about the lake it made and the history around it, but not much about the thing as it actually stands today, which is worth a look. It is, after all, still there, holding on after well over a century, which is more than you can say for most of what gets built. The Medina Dam is what is called a hollow masonry dam, and that detail tickles me, because most people picture a dam as just one enormous solid lump of concrete. This one is not entirely solid. It is hollow in places, built as a kind of structured masonry wall rather than a single poured block, which was a clever way of using less material to hold back the same amount of water. The builders also packed in limestone boulders quarried from nearby to add bulk and weight to the concrete. So the dam is partly made of the very hills it sits between. There is something pleasing about that. A wall that is partly the landscape it interrupts. To stand on it, by all accounts, is to stand on something that feels far older and heavier than its surroundings. It is over 160 feet of concrete and stone, and it has been bolted to that stretch of river since 1912, through every flood and every drought the hill country has thrown at it. The whole point of it, the entire reason for its existence, is to not move, to hold its line against the water, and it has done exactly that for generation after generation. When the lake behind it is full, you would never know what a feat that is. When the lake is as low as it is now, and you can see the great exposed face of the basin dropping away in front of it, you start to appreciate just how much of the landscape this one wall has been quietly rearranging all this time. It got its proper recognition, eventually. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places back in 1976, which is the official roll of places in America deemed worth preserving, and in 1991 it was recognized as a civil engineering landmark, with a plaque to mark it, sitting up there alongside the one for Mormon's Bluff. So it has accumulated its honors, the way a long-serving structure does. 3 plaques and 100-odd years of service. Not bad for a wall, and yet, for all that grandeur, it remains a working piece of infrastructure rather than a monument. It is not roped off behind glass. It is still doing the same job it was built for, still holding back what water there is, still feeding the diversion pool and the canals when there is enough to feed them. I rather admire that about it. Plenty of historic landmarks have long since retired into being purely decorative, things you look at but that no longer do anything. The Medina Dam is still clocking in. Over a century on, it is still the most important employee in the valley, and it has never once asked for a day off. I think there is a lesson in that, or at least a nice thought to fall asleep on. The men who built it are long gone. The British money is long gone. The certainty about the floods that never came is long gone. But the wall remains, doing its quiet work, indifferent to all the human drama that has swirled around it. Remember Henry Castro, the fellow who first looked at these canyons in the 1840s and imagined irrigated farms? Well, he did more than just imagine. He actually brought people over to settle this part of Texas, and the town he founded, the one those Medina Lake canals were eventually built to water, is a place called Castroville, named after him, and it is genuinely delightful. Castro was what they called an impresario, a colonizer who recruited settlers from Europe and brought them across to Texas to start new lives. And the settlers he brought were not the usual mix. He recruited heavily from Alsace, that region on the border between France and Germany that has spent centuries being passed back and forth between the two, and has developed its own distinct culture, its own dialect, its own architecture, somewhere in between French and German and entirely itself. He brought Alsatian families across the ocean in the 1840s and settled them along the Medina River, downstream of where the lake would one day be, and so Castroville became, and still calls itself, the Little Alsace of Texas. There are old houses there built in the Alsatian style, steep-roofed and tidy, that look like they have been picked up out of a European village and set down in the Texas countryside, which in a sense they have. For a long time, the locals even spoke a version of the Alsatian dialect, a language carried across an ocean and kept alive on the banks of a Texas river for generations, slowly fading as the old speakers passed on. It is one of those wonderful pockets of unexpected heritage that America is full of if you know where to look. A scrap of the French-German borderland transplanted whole, sitting quietly in the hill country. And it is these farms, the descendants of those Alsatian settlers and the others who followed, whose fields the great gravity-fed canal system was built to water. So the whole story loops back on itself rather beautifully. Castro dreams of irrigated farms in the 1840s. He brings Alsatian families to start those farms. 70 years later, the dam finally gets built to deliver the water he envisioned, and the water flows down out of the hills, through the canals, to the very fields his settlers cleared. The man did not live to see most of it, and the lake that made it possible took decades longer than anyone wanted, but the daydream and the town and the water all belong to the same long, slow story. Henry Castro got his irrigated farms in the end. They just took the better part of a century to arrive. I find that kind of thing genuinely lovely. We tend to think of history as a series of separate events. This happened, then that happened, but every so often you find a thread that runs straight through a century and ties it all together. One man's idea connecting an immigrant town to a doomed engineer, to a record-breaking dam, to a leaky lake, to the cattle grazing on its bottom today. It is all one story. It just took place very, very slowly, the way the best stories about land and water always do. Castroville is still there, by the way, still charming, still a little bit Alsatian, still drawing visitors who want to see the old houses and eat the old breads. It carries on the way these places do, a living echo of a decision made by one man with a good eye for land and a head full of plans. It is easy, with all this talk of dead pool and dropping wells and decade-long arguments, to forget that for an awful lot of people, for an awful lot of years, Medina Lake was simply a brilliant place to spend a summer. So let me give the good times their due, because they were real and they were lovely, and the lake will in all likelihood see them again. When the lake is full, it is a proper hill country playground. There is a county park on the Bandera side, Medina Lake Park, run by the county rather than the state, with boat ramps and a swimming area and stretches of shoreline where you can just cast a line and waste an afternoon. People drive out from San Antonio, only an hour or so away, to launch their boats and their jet skis and to swim in that cool green water, and the lake fills up with the noise of a good summer weekend. For a city of 1 million-odd people sweltering in the Texas heat, a clean, cool lake within easy reach is no small thing. And the fishing. Oh, the fishing has been the heart of it for generations. Medina has long had a reputation as a fishing lake, the quieter, less showy alternative to the big famous reservoirs, the kind of place a serious angler goes precisely because it is not overrun. Bass, catfish, the usual Texas freshwater suspects lurking in the flooded timber and the rocky drop-offs. The little fishing resorts around the shore, Miko chief among them, grew up to serve exactly that crowd, the people who wanted a cabin and a boat ramp and a quiet morning on the water with a flask of coffee and low expectations and a line in the green. There is a particular kind of person who loves a fishing lake, and I have a lot of affection for them. They are not generally there for the thrills. They are there for the sitting, the waiting, the watching the light change on the water, the not being anywhere else of it. A fishing lake is really a place to do a gentle kind of nothing, and Medina, with its 110 miles of crinkled shoreline and its coves and its drowned cypress, was a marvellous place to do nothing in. Whole families have generations of memories tied up in it, summers stacked on summers, the same cabins, the same ramps, the same patient mornings. Which is part of why the low water hurts the way it does, of course. It is not just an inconvenience or an economic problem, though it is both of those. It is the loss, for now, of a place where people were happy in a particularly simple and reliable way. When the boat ramps end in cracked mud instead of water, when the swimming area is a memory, when the fishing resort has no lake to resort to, something gentle and good goes quiet for a while. Not forever, probably, but for a while. And yet, even now, even drawn back to a sliver of itself, the lake is not gone. The deepest channel still holds water, the river still runs through the bottom of it, and the people who love it are still there, on the shore, waiting, the way fishermen are constitutionally built to wait. If there is one group of people temperamentally suited to outlasting a drought, it is the sort who will happily sit motionless for 6 hours, hoping a fish might wander by. They know how to wait for the water. They have always known. Here is something that does not get nearly enough credit in the story of any Texas lake, and it is the single greediest customer the whole reservoir has. Not the farmers, not the aquifer, not the people in the cabins, the sun. Evaporation is a quiet, relentless thief, and in a place as hot as the Texas hill country it works overtime. On a baking summer day, with the sun hammering down and the dry air pulling moisture up off the surface, a wide, shallow lake can lose a genuinely staggering amount of water straight up into the sky, every single day, without a single drop being used by anybody. The lake just breathes itself away into the heat, And Medina, remember, is wide, 18 miles long when it's full, with all that surface area spread out flat under the Texas sun. The more surface a lake shows to the sky, the more the sky takes. It is a wonderfully simple and slightly cruel piece of physics, and it gets crueler as the lake gets lower, in a way that I find genuinely a bit sad. When a lake drops, it does not just hold less water, it often spreads that smaller amount of water out across the broad, shallow flats of the lake bed, so you can end up with a thin sheet of water exposing a huge surface to the sun. A shallow lake bakes off faster than a deep one, so the drier it gets, the more efficiently the sun can finish the job. The lake becomes its own worst enemy, offering up more and more of itself to the heat just as it can least afford to. It is the sort of feedback that makes a drought so stubborn. Less water, more evaporation, even less water. This is the part of the equation that no amount of management can do much about, and it is worth holding on to when you think back to that long argument over whose fault the low water is. You can manage how much water you release to the farmers. You can manage restrictions on what people draw from their wells. You cannot manage the sun. When the rain stops and the heat sits on the hill country for months on end, the lake loses water to the sky whether anyone likes it or not, and there is no gate to close against the atmosphere. The whole system really runs on a rhythm when it is working properly. A wet season, when the rains come and the river runs high and the lake fills and the surplus seeps down to recharge the aquifer. Then a dry season, when the sun and the farmers and the seepage all draw the level back down in expectation that the next wet season will top it up again. Up and down, fill and draw, breathe in and breathe out. That is how it is meant to go. The trouble of recent years is simply that the breathing in has not been keeping pace with the breathing out. Too many dry seasons in a row, not enough wet ones to refill between them, and the lake has been slowly losing the argument with the sky. The wet seasons have not vanished, mind you. They have just been thin and unreliable of late, and the lake is doing the only thing it ever does in a dry spell, which is wait. It is very good at waiting. It has had a lot of practice. Now, while we are thinking about the wider weather, let me widen the view a little, because Medina is not suffering alone out there. Medina Lake might be one of the most dramatic examples, but it is not an isolated one. The whole of the hill country, that lovely rolling limestone region, has been getting steadily thirstier, and Medina's troubles are really just one corner of a much bigger picture. I do not say that to alarm you. I say it because it helps to understand that this is a regional weather story, not a single broken lake. Not too far away sits Canyon Lake, another well-known hill country reservoir north of San Antonio, and it has been dropping too, falling fast through the same long dry stretch. San Antonio itself has run up an enormous rainfall deficit over recent years, tens of inches of rain that simply never fell, and a shortfall like that does not stay politely in the city. It drains the whole region's lifelines, the lakes and the rivers and the springs all at once. When a place is short that much rain for that long, everything that depends on rain feels it together. And underneath all of it, quite literally, is the Trinity Aquifer, which is the groundwater much of the hill country actually drinks from. The Trinity is a different beast from the famous Edwards Aquifer we talked about earlier. The Edwards is fast and dramatic, recharging quickly through all those cracks and caves, and it is carefully watched over and managed by its own dedicated authority. The Trinity is slower, more complicated, harder to understand, and crucially, it has nothing like the same level of protection or coordinated management. It just quietly serves a huge number of hill country homes and ranches, and in the dry years it has been falling to some of the lowest levels anyone has on record. There is a lovely, melancholy image that has stuck with me from reporting on this, of ranchers driving their all-terrain vehicles straight up a riverbed they have never been able to drive up before, because the river that used to run there is simply gone, dried to cracked clay, with the big old oaks and ashes towering over them on the banks as they stand in the middle of what was a river. Springs that have flowed for as long as anyone can remember have been dwindling or going dry. It is the whole landscape getting a little drier at once, the surface water and the groundwater and the springs all sinking together, because they were always connected, the same way the lake and the wells are connected, through that shared and porous stone. And layered on top of the drought is growth, because the hill country is a beautiful place and people keep wanting to live there, and every new house and every new development and every new quarry wants its share of the same water. More straws in the same drink during a stretch when the drink is not being refilled fast enough. That is a genuine long-term tension that the region is going to have to reckon with, drought or no drought, and there are people working hard on exactly that question, on how to manage a slow, complicated aquifer in a growing region during long dry spells. It is not a solved problem, but it is being worked on by serious and thoughtful people, which is the most you can ask. I do not want to leave you with a sense of doom about any of this, because doom is not the mood, and frankly doom is not accurate either. The hill country is dry right now, drier than usual, in a dry stretch that has run longer than people would like. But it has been dry before and it has greened up again before, and the rivers that are cracked clay today have run full many times in living memory and will likely run full again. The land has a long memory and a lot of patience. Speaking of the land's patience, let me take you to the creatures that live on it, because a drought changes their world too, and watching how they cope is, in its own small way, rather wonderful. There is an old saying in Texas, attributed to all sorts of people and probably actually said by none of them, that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. And the longer you sit with the story of Medina Lake, the truer that saying feels. Because underneath the drought and the dam and the wells, there is a whole century of Texans arguing about water, and the way the law sees it is genuinely peculiar, in a way that explains a lot. Texas has a long and tangled relationship with water, and a big part of it comes down to a legal idea about groundwater that goes by the wonderfully blunt name of the rule of capture. The basic notion, simplified, is that the water under your land is yours to pump. If you own the surface, you can sink a well and draw up the groundwater beneath it, more or less as much as you like, even if your pumping happens to draw down the water under your neighbour's land too. For a very long time, that was the law of the land in Texas, plain and simple. The water belongs to whoever captures it first. It is the legal equivalent of the biggest straw wins. Now you can probably already see the trouble with that. In a wet year, with plenty of water for everyone, the rule of capture causes no arguments, because there is enough to go around and nobody much cares how much their neighbour pumps. But in a dry year, when the aquifer is low and everybody is reaching for the same shrinking pool of underground water, a law that says pump all you want is a recipe for exactly the kind of quiet, simmering conflict you find around a place like Medina. Everybody is legally entitled to take what they can get, right up until there is nothing left to get. It is a system that works beautifully until the moment it matters most. This is why, over the years, Texas has layered all sorts of local management on top of the old rule, groundwater conservation districts and special authorities set up to bring some order to particular aquifers. The Edwards Aquifer, the famous one we keep coming back to, got its own dedicated authority precisely because it is so important and so heavily drawn upon, an authority with real power to manage and limit how much gets pumped. It took decades of legal wrangling and no small amount of fighting to get there, but they got there. The Edwards is now one of the more carefully managed aquifers in the state, which is a quietly remarkable thing when you think about it. A whole region more or less agreeing to be told how much water it is allowed to take, in a state that is not generally famous for enjoying being told anything. As I mentioned earlier, plenty of the other aquifers underneath the hill country never got that level of attention, and so they are left more exposed to the old every well for itself arrangement, just as the dry years and the new houses pile on the demand. What I find genuinely fascinating about all this is that water law is really just a society writing down, in dry legal language, how it wants people to behave when there is not enough to go around. And the rule of capture says something rather particular about the time and place that produced it. It comes from an older Texas, a frontier Texas, a place that valued the rights of the individual landowner above almost everything, that was suspicious of anyone telling you what you could do on your own property, that assumed the resources were effectively endless if you were willing to work for them. Pump what is under your feet. It is yours. Do not let the government tell you otherwise. You can hear the whole mindset of a century ago in that one little rule, and the slow, difficult shift toward managing water more carefully, setting up authorities, drawing up restrictions, asking neighbours to think about each other's wells, is really the sound of that older Texas bumping up against a newer reality, one where the land is more crowded and the dry spells run longer, and the assumption that there is always more water if you dig for it has started to wear thin. It is not a comfortable shift, and it is not a finished one. The fighting the old saying talks about is still going on, in water board meetings and courtrooms and conservation districts all across the state, quietly, constantly, the way it has for generations. I do not raise all this to take a side because, as with the argument over the lake itself, I do not think there is a clean side to take. People genuinely need water for their crops and their cattle and their kitchen taps, and they genuinely disagree about how to share it when there is not enough, and those disagreements are old and deep and not going anywhere. But there is something almost reassuring in realizing that this too is an old story. Texans have been arguing about water since long before Medina Lake dropped to where it is now, and they will be arguing about it long after it fills again. The fighting over water is not a sign that something has gone uniquely wrong. It is just what people do, here, in this dry and generous and contradictory place, and have always done. Whiskey for drinking, water for fighting over, same as it ever was. A landscape like this, even a dry one, is absolutely full of life, and I would feel I had shortchanged you if we wandered around Medina Lake for an hour and never once stopped to notice what lives there. So let us slow right down and look at the wildlife for a bit, because it is calming stuff, and there is plenty of it. The star of any hill country waterway for my money is the great blue heron. If you have ever seen one, you will know. They stand in the shallows on those impossibly thin legs, utterly motionless, for what seems like hours, a tall grey-blue statue of a bird, and then in one sudden unhurried strike, they snatch a fish and go right back to standing still. They are the most patient hunters imaginable, and a low lake, with its concentrated pools and stranded fish, is in some grim way a bit of a buffet for them. Where there is water at Medina, even just the river channel along the bottom, there will very likely be a heron somewhere nearby, doing its long, slow vigil. And there are kingfishers too, those small, bright, rattling birds that hammer up and down the river, and egrets, and in the winter the ducks come through, and overhead, often, the broad lazy circles of a hawk or a vulture riding the heat. Away from the water, the hills are deer country. White-tailed deer move through that cedar and oak scrub in the cool of the morning and the evening, and the hill country is famous for them. There are armadillos rootling about in the leaf litter, doing their funny snuffling business, and if you were out at dusk you might catch the strange beauty of the bats, because this part of Texas has some of the great bat populations of the world, pouring out of caves at sundown in ribbons. And that brings me to the caves, because the same holy limestone that makes the lake leak makes the whole region a honeycomb of caves and sinkholes and underground passages. It is what they call karst country, a landscape where the rock itself is full of hollows, where water disappears underground and reappears miles away, where the surface is really just a lid over a whole hidden world of caverns. The hill country is riddled with them, and then there are the trees by the water, the bald cypress especially, which I mentioned right back at the start, but which deserve a proper look. These are magnificent old things, tall and straight, with their bases flaring out into those buttressed trunks and their odd woody knees poking up out of the wet ground around them. They line the Medina River and the creeks that feed it, and some of them are properly ancient, far older than the lake, far older than the dam, far older than Henry Castro and his Alsatian settlers. They were standing along that river when this was all just a river, and they will likely be standing there long after the current drought is a footnote. In autumn they turn a soft rusty orange, which is a rare treat in a part of the world that does not get much in the way of autumn colour, and they drop their needles and stand bare through the mild winter and green up again in spring, keeping their own slow time. Down in the water itself, where it lingers, there is a whole quieter cast of characters too. Turtles, hauled out onto half-sunk logs to bask in the sun, sliding off into the green with a soft plop the moment they sense you watching. Dragonflies stitching back and forth over the shallows on those impossibly thin glassy wings, in colours that seem too bright to be real, electric blues and reds and greens. Little fish dimpling the surface at dusk as they rise to take insects, each one leaving a spreading ring that the next one breaks. On a still evening, with the light going gold and the water flat, the whole surface comes alive with those tiny rings and ripples, the small steady business of a lake feeding itself, and you could watch it for an hour and not get bored, which is rather the point of being there at all. I find the wildlife genuinely steadying to think about, in the middle of all the human worry over water levels and wells and management. The herons do not read the drought reports. The deer do not attend the water board meetings. They simply adjust, follow the water where it is, make do with less, and carry on, the way wild things always have through every dry spell this land has ever seen. There is something in their unbothered persistence that puts the whole thing in proportion. The lake is low, the herons are fishing anyway. Life along the Medina goes on. Here is a question I find quietly satisfying, the kind that nobody ever asks but that has a genuinely interesting answer. When you read that the lake has dropped to some startling low percentage, or that it's sitting so many feet below full, how does anyone actually know that? Who is out there measuring it? And how? The answer is that lakes like this are watched constantly and carefully by people whose whole job is to keep track of where the water is. In Texas, there is a state body, the Texas Water Development Board, that maintains a running record of the levels in reservoirs all across the state, and you can go and look at the numbers for almost any lake whenever you like. There is something rather comforting about that, actually. The level of Medina Lake is not a mystery somebody guesses at. It is a measured, recorded, publicly available figure, updated as the lake rises and falls going back decades. The way they describe a lake's level is in feet above sea level, using a fixed reference point, so that the surface of the water can be pinned to an exact elevation. When the lake is full, its surface sits at a particular height. When it drops, that surface height falls, and the gap between where the water is and where it would be if it were full is the measure of how low things have got. It is a bit like a giant, very slow bathtub with a ruler painted up the side, except the ruler is calibrated to sea level, and the bathtub is 18 miles long. From that surface height, knowing the exact shape of the basin underneath, they can work out the volume of water in the lake, and from that the percentage of capacity. So the percentage you read in a headline is really the end of a chain of careful measurement, surface height to volume to percentage. There is something quietly modern about the fact that any of us can now watch this happen in close to real time. You can sit at a kitchen table hundreds of miles away and pull up the level of a lake you have never visited and follow it from week to week, the way some people follow the weather or the tides, just for the gentle rhythm of it. A small number ticking down through a dry spell, then jumping back up after a good rain. I find that oddly soothing, the idea of all these lakes across Texas being watched over by anyone who cares to look, their levels noted and shared and folded into a 100-year record that nobody owns and everyone can read. It is a small, decent thing, that openness. The lake belongs to the weather and the rock, but the knowledge of it at least belongs to all of us. And this record-keeping goes back a long way, which is what makes it so valuable. Because the lake has been measured for so many decades, we know exactly how it behaved in past droughts and past floods. We know where it stood during the dry years of the past and the wet years that followed. We know that it has been down near these levels before and climbed back out. That long memory, written down in numbers, is what lets the experts talk sensibly about whether a given low is unusual or merely part of the normal swing. Without the record, every drought would feel like the end of the world, because you would have nothing to compare it to. With the record, you can say, calmly, "We have seen this before, here is what happened last time." The same careful watching goes for the aquifers underneath. There are particular wells that get monitored as a kind of bellwether for the whole groundwater system, their levels checked regularly so that everyone can see which way the underground water is trending. The Edwards has its famous index well, watched like a hawk, the single number that tells San Antonio roughly how its great aquifer is doing on any given day. It is all part of the same impulse, the very human desire to keep an eye on the water, to know where it stands, to not be caught out. I think there is something genuinely admirable in all that patient measuring. It is not glamorous work, reading gauges and logging levels and maintaining decades of records. Nobody gets a plaque on the dam for it. But it is the reason we can talk about any of this with real numbers instead of rumour and panic, and it is the reason the people who manage the water can make decisions based on something better than a guess. Somewhere out there, the level of Medina Lake is being noted down, today, the way it has been noted down for 100 years, quietly, reliably, whether the lake is full to the brim or drawn back to almost nothing. Now, the more cheerful question, the one everybody around that lake is really asking. What would it take to fill it back up? So how does a lake like this actually recover? Because it does recover, that is the thing to hold on to. It has done it over and over across its long, moody life. The question is just what it takes, and the answer is, in a word, rain. But not just any rain. A particular kind in a particular place at a particular pace. Here is the slightly counterintuitive part. A few nice afternoon showers, the sort that green up your lawn, do almost nothing for a reservoir this low. To meaningfully refill Medina, you need rain falling not so much on the lake itself, but across the whole watershed upstream, the entire area of hills and valleys that drains down into the Medina River. When heavy, sustained rain falls across that watershed, the river swells, and all that water comes pouring down the channel and into the lake, and the level can climb genuinely fast. The lake fills from its river, not from the rain landing directly on its surface, and the river only runs high when the wider country upstream has had a proper soaking, and the hill country, when it decides to rain, can really rain. This is a part of the world prone to sudden dramatic downpours, the kind that can drop an astonishing amount of water in a short time. That is a double-edged thing, of course, because the same intense rain that can refill a reservoir in days can also cause dangerous flooding, as the region knows all too well and has learned at terrible cost. The hill country has a grim nickname, Flash Flood Alley, earned honestly. So the very weather that the lake needs to recover is weather that has to be treated with enormous respect. There is no gentle, convenient way for a lake this low to fill. It tends to come in a rush, or not at all. A lot of the biggest refilling rains, historically, have come from the remnants of tropical systems, hurricanes, and tropical storms that blow in off the Gulf of Mexico, lose their fury over land, and then sit and dump their moisture across central Texas. A single well-placed tropical system parking itself over the right watershed can do more for a struggling reservoir in a few days than a whole season of ordinary weather. So in a strange way, the people hoping to see Medina full again are partly hoping for the leftovers of a storm, the soft wet tail end of something that started as a hurricane far out at sea. What you do not get usually is a slow, steady, sensible refill. That is just not how this lake works and never has been. Remember, it took 7 years to fill the first time, then spent a century lurching up and down. Recovery, when it comes, tends to come suddenly. A wet stretch breaking a dry one, the river roaring back to life, the level jumping week to week, the boat ramps reaching water again, the fishermen returning, the whole place exhaling. It does not creep back. It comes back in a rush, the way it briefly did in the summer of 2025 before the dry conditions reasserted themselves. So the honest answer to when will the lake recover is the same honest answer this lake has always offered. When the rain comes, nobody can tell you exactly when that will be, and anyone who claims to is guessing. But the long history of the place says it will come, eventually, probably suddenly, probably wrapped up in some big dramatic weather system rolling in off the Gulf. And when it does, the lake will fill, and the ground around it will drink, and the wells will steady, and the herons will have somewhere new to fish, and for a while everyone will forget how worried they were. Until the next dry spell. That is the deal this lake has always offered, and the people who love it have always, in the end, taken it. We have spent a long time talking about the lake, but I want to end the wandering down by the river, because the river was here first, and the river will be here last. And in a funny way, the river is the truest version of this place. The lake is a guest. The Medina River is the host. Upstream of the lake, before the water ever reaches the still flat reservoir, the Medina River is a genuinely beautiful thing. It runs clear and cool and green through the hill country, fed by springs seeping out of that limestone, threading between banks lined with cypress and oak, sliding over pale rock ledges, pooling up deep and quiet in the shady bends. It is the kind of river people fall in love with, cold enough to make you gasp on a hot day, clear enough to see straight to the gravel on the bottom, lined with those great old cypress trees holding the banks together with their roots. This is the river Henry Castro saw. This is the river those men decided to wall up. And the upper stretches of it above the lake still run more or less the way they always have, drought permitting. When the lake drops, as we walked through earlier, the old riverbed reappears along the bottom of the reservoir, and the river briefly becomes a river again all the way through, finding its ancient channel through the cracked clay. There is something almost tender about that to me. Underneath the lake, the river never really went anywhere. It was always there, drowned but intact, its old course waiting beneath the still water. And when the lake pulls back, the river quietly resumes, picking up exactly where it left off, as though it had simply been holding its breath for 100 years. A river is a more patient and more permanent thing than a lake, in the end. A lake made by a dam is, for all its size, a fairly recent and fairly fragile arrangement. It depends on the wall holding and the rain coming and the management working and 100 other things lining up. A river just runs. It has been running through these canyons for an unimaginably long time, carving the very rock the dam is anchored to, and it will keep running, in fat years and lean ones, long after all our current worries have washed downstream and out to sea. The lake is a chapter, the river is the book. I find that thought deeply calming, and I hope you do too if you're still with me, which you very possibly are not. The current drought is hard and real, and it matters to the people living it. But it is a chapter, not the ending. The river underneath has seen droughts come and go since long before there were people here to fret about them, and it has run through every one of them, and it will keep doing the one thing it has always done, which is simply to keep moving quietly downhill toward the sea, indifferent to our percentages and our plaques and our worried headlines. There is a great deal of peace in a thing that just carries on. Let me give you one more picture before we finish, the loveliest one I have, and then I will let you go. If you are ever lucky enough to be out at Medina Lake at night, away from the city, away from the lights, I think you would understand why people put up with all the trouble of living there. Because the hill country, out away from San Antonio, still has properly dark skies, the kind most of us have forgotten exist. When the sun goes down behind the hills and the heat finally eases off, the whole place settles into a deep quiet. The water, what there is of it, goes black and still. The cypress trees turn to silhouettes along the bank, and overhead, slowly, as your eyes adjust, the stars come out in numbers that genuinely startle people who have only ever seen city skies. Not a scatter of stars, but a whole crowded, dusty sky full of them, the faint band of the Milky Way smeared across the middle of it. More stars than you could ever count, the kind of sky our ancestors took for granted and most of us never see anymore. The sounds change at night too. The daytime noise of boats and wind gives way to the gentle business of nocturnal things. The frogs start up along whatever water remains, that steady creaking chorus. Crickets. The occasional splash of a fish, or a heron shifting in the shallows. Far off, maybe, the yip of a coyote, which sounds lonelier than it is, because they are very rarely actually alone. And the warm air, full of the smell of cedar and dry grass and water, the particular smell of a Texas night in the hills. It is a deeply restful place to be, a lake at night, even a low one. Especially a low one, maybe, when it has gone quiet and the crowds have left it to itself. I think about the dam sitting there in the dark, holding its line the way it has every night for over a century. I think about the river running along the bottom of the basin, finding its old course in the blackness, doing its patient downhill work whether anyone is watching or not. I think about the herons roosting in the cypress, and the deer moving through the cedar, and the bats pouring out of the limestone caves, and the people in the cabins on the shore, asleep, or lying awake listening to the frogs, with their hauled water in the tanks outside and the long uncertain wait for rain. All of it, the whole connected web of it, sitting quietly together under that enormous crowded sky. There is nothing to do on a night like that, but be still and let the place be what it is. No urgency, no fixing it. Just a lake, low for now, in a landscape that has been low before, under stars that have watched it rise and fall 100 times and will watch it 100 more. It is, when you stop trying to solve it, an extraordinarily peaceful thing to sit with, which feels like the right note to end on. So that is Medina Lake, a reluctant reservoir on a moody river, dreamed up by a man who never saw it finished, built by 1,500 men in a tearing hurry for floods that did not come, leaking its water quietly into the rock to feed cities that have never heard of it, holding up the wells of the people on its shore until it cannot, and currently drawn back to around 4% of itself, the lowest a lot of folks have ever seen it, waiting as it has always waited for the rain. I hope, if you're somehow still awake, that it does not feel like a sad story, because I do not think it is one, not really. It is a story about a place that has always lived by the rain, that has gone down before and come back before, that is having a hard, long, dry stretch right now, and will, in all likelihood, come through it the way it has come through every dry stretch in its 100-odd years. The people on the shore are tough and patient and used to a temperamental lake. The river underneath is older than all of it and runs through every drought it has ever seen. And the dam still stands, still works, still holds its line. Nobody can promise exactly when the water comes back. That is not how this lake has ever worked. But the long view, the 100-year view, is steady, and there is comfort in that. The wet seasons have not vanished. They are just running late the way they have run late before, and one day the rain will come back the way it always has, in its own time and without any warning, and the river will run high, and the basin will fill, and the long dry argument with the sky will be over for a while. The boats will go back out, the wells will settle, and all of this worry will feel for a season at least like something that happened to some other lake. Until then, it sits there in the hill country dark, low and quiet and patient, under all those stars, and there are worse things to fall asleep thinking about than a quiet lake, waiting for rain, in good time, in no hurry at all. That is all for tonight. Sleep well wherever you are. I will see you on the next slow wander.